Good afternoon, everybody. I am Mary Louise Kelly. I'm a journalist with NPR. I have covered national security for many years at this point, and I was anchoring on January 6th, 2021, when we at NPR went into live coverage, and then we held the air hour after hour after hour as we watched what was unfolding. That was a day that I think whatever your politics, none of us would care to repeat in our democracy. We're here for this next session to consider the question, what if? What might happen next year, January 6th, 2025? And the film that we're here to talk about considers that question. We have several clips of the film. We're going to be playing them. These are short clips throughout our session. And before I introduce the panel, I want to let you see them and get the briefest taste of them. So here's the first clip.
All of us are here today because we are increasingly concerned by the rise of domestic extremism and radicalization in this country, specifically within the active duty military forces. I don't need to tell you that the alarms are flashing red. Most of you have at one point sworn under oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Today we'll examine a frightening scenario. What happens when those in uniform break that oath?
I think what brought us all together is a need to be better prepared. And the exercise is Introduction to Coup Prevention 101.
I'm a retired lieutenant general. I spent 37 years in the Army. I'm pretty adamantly nonpartisan. In fact, that was one of my conditions for participation, that it was not a partisan exercise, because this should not be about politics. This is about security.
Okay, so Coup Prevention 101. Let me introduce you to the stars you'll be watching as we make our way through this movie. Janessa Goldbeck, who is CEO of Vet Voice Foundation. It's a national nonprofit that advocates for veterans and military families and their participation in our democracy. Next to her, General Linda Singh, who's founder and CEO of Kaleidoscope Effect and a retired Major General in the Maryland Army National Guard. And Heidi Heitkamp, who now runs the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, but was North Dakota, former senator from North Dakota. So welcome to you all. Janessa, kick us off. Explain the premise of this film, War Game.
Sure. Well, we, as you said, we run a national veterans advocacy organization, and I myself am a Marine Corps veteran. I served 7 years as a combat engineer officer, and we are increasingly concerned about the rise of extremism in the ranks, both in the active duty forces and in the veterans community. You know, 1 out of 5 of those charged in the January 6th insurrection were veterans, which is massively disproportionate to our share of society. And so a couple of years ago, right after January 6th, 2021, some of the general officers in our network wrote an op-ed that called on the administration to take a look at this issue really seriously. And one of their recommendations was to do a war game. In military and government speak, a war game is when you bring people together, you give them an unscripted scenario, they each have roles to play, and they sort of walk through what their response to a particular event would be. And that allows you to see vulnerabilities in our democracy, vulnerabilities in our system, and to plan for those. We thought it was really important that this happened, so we decided to stage this war game ourselves. We have this incredible network of folks, very senior folks from 35 folks from the last 5 presidential administrations. We brought them together on January 6th, 2023 to role play an unscripted scenario. What happens if we have another contested election in this country and a candidate refuses to concede, but this time calls on members of the active duty military to help them?
So to be clear, it's a fictional scenario, knock on wood, fictional scenario, but with people who have real life experience playing the senior roles. Linda, explain the role that you're playing.
So the role that I play in the film is I'm the chief of the National Guard Bureau. So the National Guard Bureau kind of sets the policy and regulations across the 54 states and territories, but is not in control of each of the adjutants generals. And then I also play the role of the DC commander, which is very different than the adjutants generals, but yet the same level of role in DC, since the district of Colombia is not a state, they don't really have an adjutant general, so they have a commander.
Yeah. And Heidi, you are playing a senior advisor to the President of the United States. And I've already told you, when you watch this film, you will be cheering her on because every single thing she says, the men are like, I don't know, but we could do this, we could do this. She's like, gentlemen, focus. Fiddling, Rome is burning, just do it. Explain what you brought to this and what you're hoping to get out of it.
Well, Steve Bullock, who a lot of you know, former governor from Montana, played the president, and I was senior advisor. And I think those of us who have been in the political world know that you have the traditional advisors, whether it is your Secretary of Defense, your Secretary of Homeland Security, but then you have the inner circle of people who really look at the entire field and say, okay, we've got to deal with this crisis, but what do we do tomorrow? What do we need to be saying that is going to enhance your reputation as a leader? What should we be thinking about that other people aren't thinking about? And so I was senior advisor to President Heitkamp, who was played by Steve Bullock, and it really was my job almost to be provocative. And that's the role that I played, raising issues that weren't being raised at the time in the kind of arena of the moment.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get to the who might be behind something like another mob, a potential coup, unfolding in Washington. Let's roll clip 2, please.
A new video has been released on social media by the heads of the so-called Order of Columbus, the extremist group which has long challenged the legitimacy of the US government. Retired Army Lieutenant General Roger Sims, who the order refers to as the Patriarch, is claiming to have evidence of a stolen election, and the group is backing those members of the military who have appeared to have gone rogue. Now, this video was released just a short time ago. We're going to play it for you. A word of warning, some of what you'll hear is disturbing.
We have undertaken an extensive investigation of the 2024 election.
And it is Hotham who is attempting a coup to consolidate his illegitimate power and eliminate our God-given freedoms.
So the red cell is motivated not just by a failed candidate who's trying to steal the presidency, but also by a religious figure, someone with military experience who comes with a lot of credibility, like former General Michael Flynn, a convicted felon who spent his career fighting against insurgencies. It is not unrealistic that figures like him could play roles in an attack.
Those of you who are feeling weak tonight, those of you that don't have the moral fiber in your body, get some tonight, because tomorrow we the people are going to be here, and we want you to know that we will not stand for a lie. We will not stand for a lie.
A figure like that can be used to help recruit Americans into a belief system that justifies violence against other Americans to achieve political goals, which is the definition of terrorism.
Okay, so y'all will notice as we go, it's a mix, and part of what I thought made it so powerful is you're seeing real, recent news footage of things that have actually verifiably happened in the country, and then cutting back and forth with the war game scenario of, okay, well, what if that took just one turn down a dark alley? Where might we be then? Janessa, speak to why you decided to kind of set up the film in that way, where you're blending real and potential threat.
Well, first of all, we felt it was really important to take it outside of the frame of Democrats and Republicans, Trump versus Biden. So you'll see, we hired some actors to play some of the roles of the general who's gone rogue and troops who've gone rogue. But we also wanted to make sure that we were actually zeroing in on things that have already occurred in this country and just turning up the dial half a notch and making them all happen at once, so that we could really understand a worst case scenario, what might break, what are norms that we expect from our elected leaders or from national candidates, and what are things that are actually laws, where are there not powers that we could actually...
When you say turning up the dial and imagining, what if all the things happened all at once? Things like what?
So in this scenario, it begins with the National Guard being pre-positioned on the mall because leaders have learned from January 6, 2021. But a very small faction of National Guardsmen actually turning their weapons around on those they are there to protect. So a very small group of radicalized guardsmen, which of course leads to some chaos and understanding who is actually there to protect the House and Congress and who is there to actually do some real damage. It then escalates outside of DC. And so we see protests. The Order of Columbus is the extremist group that we made up. It's a mishmash of real groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. But we see protests and demonstrations at state capitals. In one case, we actually see a capitol overrun. And we also see a couple of small units, but still very chaos-inducing actors defecting from the active duty force, stealing weapons, et cetera. So all of these things are things that have happened in America's past, but they haven't all happened at once, and they haven't all happened in the context of having a major figure at the national level egging them on or encouraging them to participate.
And Linda, take us inside just the perspective, military perspective, but obviously the National Guard, because it's one of the kind of questions at the very beginning of the film where people are starting to realize things are going very badly wrong very quickly. The National Guard is there, and we're not totally clear. Are they defending the Capitol, or are they about to help ransack it?
Right, and so in this particular scenario, we had both sides, right? So you had individuals within the Guard that are doing and fulfilling their duties. And then you had those small numbers that were not, which just increases the level of chaos. And when you start seeing that spread, state by state by state, that becomes a huge concern. Yeah. Because now we're not just trying to deal with what's happening in the district, we're now trying to deal with what's going on in multiple states and what is the ground truth. So how do we very quickly get a ground truth understanding of how many numbers are we talking about? Is this really a serious problem, or is this just what social media is putting out? So what is really happening on the ground? And that's always tough in these types of situations when chaos starts hitting. I hate to say that, but when you have multiple things hitting and now you're trying to understand what's real and what's not, and how are we going to take action that won't escalate and kind of inflame things more, but really to get control.
Yeah. Heidi, speak to that as someone who's sat, at the senior levels of political power in Washington, and those moments early in a situation that could go in any number of directions, where good people are trying to make the right decision with incredibly imperfect, incomplete information.
Well, it is incredibly difficult, and that world of trust that we've built up, the trust that if I tell Linda as the Adjutant General of Maryland that to have her National Guard do something, that they're going to do it, that there won't be any blip in that chain of command. And now all of a sudden you're seeing the opportunity for these divisions within trusted organizations. And this is an incredibly difficult kind of situation, especially in one thing that Janessa didn't say, they were stirring the pot. You saw the red cell, which was when you heard the general speaking, and then you saw two guys, they were just sitting there on their computers, throwing up stuff, making it look like this was bigger than what it was, that there was more people actively engaged. And so that's where the trust comes in and the systems that you have to rely on to know what's going on. When you look at the film, there's a point at which we're trying to decide whether we shut down the bridges into DC, whether there's people amassing on the other side that are going to come to the assistance of the insurrectionists who were storming the Capitol, and we're trying to decide what do we know about who's on the other side in Maryland or in Virginia. Completely plausible. All of this is completely plausible in the fog of a situation like this. And I think one of the things that Janessa didn't say, but Vote Vets and her organization has actually issued a formal report that talking about our experience and what we felt was the vulnerabilities and what we know. But that trust and the fog of the situation was the most difficult part, because information on any given day is incomplete and potentially incorrect, especially when someone's using social media to basically spew out misinformation at a grand scale.
Well, and that was one of the decision moments in the film, when to try to kick the Order of Columbus off of social media, shut down their accounts, block it, which is hard because they just spring up under a new name, a new entity, under individual accounts, et cetera, but controlling that information flow and trying to decide how to do it. Okay, we're gonna watch one more clip. This is where things start to get really scary because things are starting to happen outside the Beltway. Let's roll the third clip, please.
Mr. President, you'll want to see this from your special advisor. MacDill Air Force Base appears to have been taken over by insurgents. Active duty soldiers across the country are leaving their posts or being removed from duty, including 12 Special Operations Forces based at MacDill Air Force Base, who have declared the base to be sovereign land, no longer subject to the jurisdiction of this illegal government. Further reports indicate that at many of these bases, there are corresponding accounts of ammunition, explosives, and other weapons missing from armories. Lastly, several disloyal forces have been caught trying to steal weapons and become trapped inside the armory, creating complicated standoffs between loyal forces and entrapped disloyal ones.
You have 12 special ops.
Yeah, it says that.
MacDill, you reading this?
Yeah.
So remember that Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. There are times when you start throwing the bullshit flag, and you start fiddling around with niceties, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Mr. President, we're picking up intercepted chatter among military that they're taking what happened at MacDill and now they're trying to spread that to other bases.
How many soldiers are at MacDill?
12 that have gone rogue is what I understood.
Not that many. These are 12, you know, gung-ho killers out there who decided to take it in their own hands.
So
you got two 4-star generals down there.
The concern we're getting is the chatter that this may spread, and y'all need to be aware of that.
General Clark there playing a very convincing chairman of the Joint Chiefs. General Singh, so the scenario we just saw, MacDill Air Force Base in Florida taken over, declared sovereign land no longer subject to the jurisdiction authority of U.S. law. What is going through your mind? What questions do we need to be asking?
So first off, no way in hell that's going to happen, right? There's just too many troops there that would, and too many leaders that would activate. But could it cause a lot of chaos? Yes. So the first things that go through my mind, especially as I'm thinking about that, and it's looking at the active duty versus the Guard, because in that case, you would be looking at active duty versus Guard. Two completely, I hate to say completely different scenarios, but the realism of, you know, them kind of taking control of the base, what immediately goes to my mind is, where is the National Guard? What is the governor doing? Because that base falls within the bounds of a state, right? And the governor should be saying, what are we now doing and what are we bringing to bear? Because we have systems and processes and policies. And so what we couldn't see as part of the word game, because you don't get every piece of information, right? What we couldn't see is what were those other entities doing that allowed us to have, you know, better decision making. And in reality, that would be the way it is, right? Like we would be trying to really figure out, like, you know, who has control of this, who has taken action, who's been called up. And, you know, with that particular base, you would have not only there are military, police, there are other folks on the base that would respond, but then you have the local authorities that are going to respond. And then you also have the Guard that's going to respond. So I think, you know, making sure that, and I think what hits me is having served at that level and running the Guard, information between us and communicating and showing up and knowing that, oh, okay, you're the Homeland Security Director in Maryland. Oh, I know who you are. And you're the superintendent or the chief of police for the state. I know who you are. And we're not exchanging cards at the time that a situation has happened, because in many cases, that is what we're doing, is we're getting there and trying to figure out the right and left limits, and chaos, sets in.
I mean, a question for both of you with military experience. The central question that it sounds like drove you to want to produce a film like this was the rise of extremism in the ranks of the U.S. military. I mean, how good a job is the U.S. military doing at trying to address extremism in the ranks?
Well, first of all, I'll say that I think the vast majority of those in uniform are loyal to the Constitution, to their oath. They're doing the right thing. They will do the right thing. But as we see, play out over the course of the film and the scenario, it doesn't take a whole lot of folks to create a really, really bad situation. And the military is a reflection of our society. So any problem that we see in our society, the rise of extremism, polarization, disinformation, misinformation, you're going to see that in the active duty ranks. How good of a job is the military doing to address it? Well, I will say the first attempt to do so after January 6, 2021 was a half-day stand down. What that means is a sergeant gets up in front of a PowerPoint and says, don't be an extremist, don't go on extremist websites. Okay, everybody sign this piece of paper, good to go, thanks. We think there's a lot more that could be done at the front end when it comes to recruiting, practices that Fortune 500 companies use to screen folks' social media, et cetera. There's a lot of great research and information out there about how to do this work, but it's become such a polarized topic that even the congressional hearings on the subject, even the delivery of our report was seen as controversial and partisan. There are those in Congress and on the right who have said it is disrespectful to our troops to say that there are extremists in the ranks. Well, I believe that if you love an institution, you work to make it stronger, and I love the Marine Corps, and I care about our U.S. military and the integrity of our institutions, and so we see a problem. We thought, who better than veterans to call this out and produce some solutions?
Yeah. Do you want to jump in on that?
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely correct. And, I like the fact that Janessa said, we sit them down and we do these PowerPoints. We're still trying to figure out why we're still having suicides and why we're still having, sexual assaults and things. And that's because we pull you in and we set you down, we give you these level of PowerPoints, but we never ever have the conversation or allow you to have the conversation about how you're feeling and, where are you in terms of your mind and your space, and how is that going to affect your judgment? Because as a leader, I should be asking you, you have that view. How is that going to affect your judgment? Please help me understand. And then what resources do I need to give you to really help you move your position? And we do this time and time again. And so at some point here, we are going to have to make a decision to say what we're doing is not working. So let's do something different.
Yeah. One of the things that we haven't talked about is law enforcement. So you saw a disproportionate number of retired military in the January 6th insurrection. You also saw a disproportionate number of ex-police, ex-sheriffs. And so when if Steve were here, if Steve Bullock were here, he tells a story when he was the Attorney General of Montana, the Oath Keepers were actively recruiting people to apply for the State Highway Patrol.
Yeah.
And so let's not forget that when you don't have those systems in place, there are people who are going to look at that vulnerability. And one thing that was so instrumental is to show how a small number of people who would in fact engage in and infiltrate these organizations could create a level of chaos that was, very, very dangerous to democracy. And so don't forget, yes, do they get radicalized in the military? I always make this point. Janet Napolitano, when she was Homeland Security Secretary, actually one of the last things she did was issue a report about radicalization in the military. That was before Donald Trump. And so this is not a new issue, and these groups have been recruiting into organizations that have some semblance of power so that when the time comes to exercise that militia, power, they've got people on the ground who are ready to go. So, I mean, I don't mean to scare you more than what maybe you're already scared, but we need to realize it's not just radicalization once someone gets there, but people come to it with the goal of being disruptors eventually.
The other possibility that this war game scenario asks us to consider is, and I'm willing to believe you when you say, like, the vast majority of people who are enlisted in our armed services or enlisted in law enforcement are good people trying to do their job, protect their community and our country. Great. The film sets up the scenario where the commander-in-chief is in a bunker saying, do this, but you have a general who's gone rogue, who's on TV and live streaming saying, if you really want to protect our country and democracy, don't listen to him. We gotta go this way. That's terrifying. How do you work against that?
Well, we've already seen it, and Michael Flynn is now a convicted felon. There were several active duty military officers during the pandemic who took to social media to express, their beliefs, which was, breaking a major norm, and many of them faced criminal prosecution for that. But we really aren't in a place where we've had to deal with it in the context of an election. And one of the things that makes a general officer or a group of veterans so powerful is that veterans are one of the last groups in American society that have cross-partisan respect and appeal. And that's one of the reasons why they are targeted for recruitment into extremist groups, because not only do they have tactical skills and knowledge, but they are incredibly impactful vectors for information and mis and disinformation. People trust a general officer, and so it really sets up a very challenging moment for our democracy.
Okay, I want to move us to the focus on the commander-in-chief. We're going to cue up the last film clip we have. This is looking at the president weighing his options, and that the buck really does stop there.
This is going to be a defining moment of your presidency.
It is, but here's what's missing in this. We have to understand why they want to give command and control to the president. The Insurrection Act is a trap.
We need to have a further conversation.
It's a defining moment in their governorship.
We have what? Mr. President, your audience is the American public, and they want to know that Congress is coming back to certify. So we do have to come to agreement here, because time is moving on. You have to decide which way you're going to want to move.
Mr. President, 10 minutes remaining.
The president is sweaty. He's going to have to make a decision.
Mr. President, are you invoking the Insurrection Act or federalizing National Guard? Neither has happened yet. I'm not asking you, I'm asking the president. Are you doing either?
Mr. President?
Mr. President.
Mr. President. Mr. President. Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Put your fucking cards on the table.
Mr. President.
Mr. President.
I don't know if we're allowed to say that on the...
Okay, so big debate unfolding there over whether to invoke the Insurrection Act. This is the 1807 law that allows the president to deploy the U.S. military domestically in the service of putting down a rebellion against the United States. Heidi, let me ask the provocative question. What's the downside? Like, what's the danger of overreacting by the time you're here?
I think it is that you are sending a message that you are no longer, that the norms and the rule of law are no longer valid. You need to take, it's like a nuclear option, right? You now are in charge of deploying the military against American citizens. That is one of the most serious things that you can do. And behind this all was this idea of past failure of the invocation of the Insurrection Act, whether it was at Waco or Ruby Ridge, and those things are still with us. But also, you might recall that Flynn and a lot of these patriot groups, so-called patriot groups, wanted President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act against the Black Lives Matter movement, and even on the day to stop the steal. And so if you use it indiscriminately or unnecessarily, then that gives permission for the next person to use it. And I think in the president, in this case, Steve's perspective, it would taint his opportunity to reunite the country. And so it has consequences beyond the immediacy of the moment. And so if you think you can control the situation using a much more contained and better defined traditional power, those measures need to be exhausted before you ever invoke the Insurrection Act. And so it may sound like it's not a big deal, but it is a huge deal in jurisprudence, and it is a huge deal for our democracy when the President of the United States invokes the Insurrection Act against the citizens of this country.
Can I just say that we did this exercise on January 6, 2023. At that point, we didn't know who the nominees were going to be, and the Insurrection Act was something that wonks and legal scholars and military folks were thinking about, but really hadn't hit mainstream. Since then, obviously, former President Trump is the nominee and has said repeatedly, and has been backed up by reports put out by entities like the Heritage Foundation, that when reelected, he will deploy the Insurrection Act on day one to do a number of things, to send National Guard and active duty military to Democratic cities, to take over law enforcement functions, to deport 11 million undocumented folks, and to send them to the border. And that would be an incredible, vast shift in how we as Americans expect our military to be used and where it's used. And so now it is something that isn't just, we're not just talking about using the military to put down or quell unrest, we're talking about it to use it proactively to take over law enforcement and border security missions in a way that we've never seen in this country. We haven't seen in several hundred years.
Yeah. And I think just to add on to that, because me, having led the National Guard in Maryland and having been at the forefront of a civil disturbance, taking it to that next level, here's basically what that means is I'm now standing with a weapon, pointing at my friends, my family, and I'm having to take sides. And that is what I have to do in other countries to support individuals and people. And that is the most extreme measure, and I don't even like when we have to do it then. Asking us to do that here in the US, is that what we want to define us? That's not what we've been in hundreds of years. And so you're now asking us to step in and treat you as third-class citizens. And that, to me, is crossing a level that we can't go to.
If I can just add another thing, the whole goal of the Red Cell, the disruptors, was to try and get us to invoke the Insurrection Act. So it wasn't just, were we going to use this tool? It's that the opposition, the insurrectionists, wanted us to use the tool because they thought it would grow the more, bring more people on their side to the fight. Yeah. And so just understand that for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And that was the balance. And, you'll have to watch the movie to find out if we did it.
All right, well, now that we all have the bejesus scared out of us, a question that I would love to hear from each of you on, and I'll start with you, Heidi, and we'll work our way down. Just how real a possibility do you think this is?
Well, I think it's a very real possibility.
A coup in our country next year.
In this scenario, the president is reelected, and the opposition is coming from a challenger who refuses to concede, who then engages these militia groups to basically act as his private militia. I think that one of the reasons, and we get asked this question quite a bit, why do we do it? Because it's not always comfortable to open up this kind of wound that we have in America and examine it. But if we don't do it as citizens, if we don't do it as people who have taken an oath to the Constitution, we're failing that oath. I always tell people, you can't fix a problem you won't admit you have. And so this is a way to admit we have a problem of division in this country that could potentially lead to very serious political violence, and we need to explore it. And it's interesting because when you look at what is happening now, and we all remember where we were and what we thought of on January 6th. It didn't matter which side of the political aisle you were on. All of my friends, and I come from a very conservative state, were literally stunned and upset and saw what was happening to the Capitol, believed that was wrong. Over time, we're being gaslit, right? We're being told nothing to see here. They're tourists. They are, in fact, political prisoners, that they didn't do anything wrong. In fact, the Supreme Court's going to decide a decision probably this week on Thursday that'll have dramatic consequences for these prosecutions. What happens if the Supreme Court basically, the result of that is that half the prosecutions are thrown out? Where's the deterrence? And that will be seen as a major victory. And so I think that it is not an exaggeration to say that we need to be prepared. Is it probable? God, I hope not. Is it possible? Absolutely.
Linda, how real a possibility? A coup in this country, January 6, 2025?
Well, no matter what happens in November, somebody's not going to be happy. Some group of people are not going to be happy. And so what concerns me about that is everything that we've seen, just there's so much going on right now that I'm not real sure that we can stop ourselves from going to that level before we can turn it around. And so my fear is that regardless of which way this goes, we're going to see, maybe not to the same as January 6th, but I think we're going to see some level of violence at least start up. And I pray to God that our states have exercised, have gotten to know one another, have played this out, because that's really what this is about, is making sure that we're exercising and knowing what we need to do in the event. And I pray to God that they are ready to tamp down on this as soon as we start seeing the potential. We can't wait, and we can't just assume that, oh, well, they're not going to do X. No, when it happens, we've got to tamp down on it. That means military, civilian, at the highest levels. And so I'm scared.
Janessa, I'm going to tell people we are going to try to take audience questions. So if you have one, once Janessa speaks, we're going to have mics, I think, on both sides of the room. I'll try to take 2 or 3 if I can. So get them ready. Janessa.
Before I served in the Marines, I worked as a human rights advocate, specifically in civilian protection in conflict zones, Darfur, Myanmar, in countries where in places where civilian populations turned on each other. And one of the things I think about every single day is if you took some of the warning systems that we have in place in our foreign policy apparatus and applied them to the United States, the alarm bells would be blaring red. The rhetoric that has come, the number of Americans, over 30% of Americans now say that they're comfortable with violence as a means of solving political dispute. And the things that former administration officials have said about actions former President Trump wanted to take in his presidency are extraordinarily concerning. Go back and read some of the things that General Kelly, General Mattis have said after coming out of their terms of service. Regardless of whether President Trump wins or loses, as General Singh said, someone's not going to be happy. And this time around, there will be no serious adults in the room to prevent some of the worst actors. So at the end of the day, look, I'm an eternal optimist, but I also own a gun.
All right, over to you. We have some questions. We have mics making, let's see, I'll take this lady right here toward the front. Hi.
As individual citizens, because we're not going to be in these rooms making these decisions, what can we do to help us be less afraid and feel like we have some control or something to contribute to preventing this violence?
Great question. I will repeat it just in case people in the back couldn't hear because the mic wasn't great. What can we as individual citizens who are not in a position of power in Washington do? What can we do?
Well, I think a lot. The first is, as Heidi said, admitting that we have a problem and being willing to engage. So sometimes the scope of this is so overwhelming, as you said, you could disempower you to even take the first step. We have an election coming up in this country. We have folks on the ballot, up and down the ballot, from the president all the way down, who are going to make a difference in a scenario like this. So if you're not involved, you need to be. And that doesn't necessarily mean, I'm sure there's lots of folks in this room who can give monetarily, but also well beyond that is being involved as a canvasser, making phone calls, but really just even talking to friends of yours who might be thinking of sitting out this election. Let's be totally blunt. We have a lot of folks in this country that we in politics and advocacy call double haters. They're frustrated with both choices. And one of the things that Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vidman says, he was an advisor on this project, is it's like you're on a plane and the stewardess is offering you a sandwich made of glass and a chicken sandwich. And folks are asking, well, how's the chicken prepared? We all have folks in our life who are asking that question, and look, there are legitimate grievances folks have on any number of issues, but I'm tired of hearing that this is the most important election of my lifetime. I've heard that every election I've ever been able to vote in, but this one really is. And so if you're not having those tough and uncomfortable conversations with people in your own life, I'd say that's a really good place to start.
Great. Let's see there. I see a couple hands over here. Yep, right here. Thank you.
That was a great wake-up call for anyone who wasn't already freaked out about it. But I'm also worried that it's a roadmap for people who are on the other side. I can imagine, and you can just picture who they would be, the governors of certain states who would refuse to call the National Guard and would be very willing to help in this whole process. And how do you deal with that?
They don't need a roadmap. I mean, honestly, they're so much better prepared than we are. And this is not a new movement. When you look at the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, in my state it was the Posse Comitatus. These militant groups have been around for a long, 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 long time. And they consider themselves, and you need to understand the dynamics. And it's too bad Elizabeth Newman just wrote an amazing book, and I would recommend it. It's called about white Christian nationalism. She's evangelical. She is a domestic terrorism expert. And so, very important book. And she does address some of the how do we as society deal with those things. But if you think that we're going to treat or teach these people new tricks, we're so far behind them. They are way ahead of us in terms of knowing how to disrupt, knowing how to organize, knowing how to drill. And so we've got to play catch up. And the other thing that I would say to the previous question is governors are critically important in this fight. A lot of you know your governor. A lot of you know your chief of police. And it's not too much to ask them, what are you going to do if this happens in your state capital? What are you going to do, and how are you preparing to identify, structures and tactics and kind of who's going to be on the spot? How prepared are you? One of the things Janessa didn't tell you is, as follow on to this, they're doing exercises in a lot of states, starting with Arizona. And so we aren't just stopping with this Capitol Hill exercise. We're looking at how we're going to bring that kind of knowledge to state capitals and to local jurisdictions.
Yeah, but I also want to add on, just so that you understand how the adjutants generals are key in this. And if we think that the adjutants generals are not having conversations about what their governors will allow and what they don't, I mean, those are the things that we grapple with from an adjutants general perspective. And we know our governors. And so we're able to have that with the 54 states and territories, all of us, because they get together multiple times of the year. They're on calls every single month. And these types of issues are what comes up. And we're asking ourselves, well, is your governor going to step in and do the right thing? I mean, that's the question that we're always asking about a lot of the tough decisions. And it is up to the adjutants generals to say, well, no, we're not going to be able to make that decision. Okay, Guard Bureau, I'm taking that down. I know where I got a problem. And so don't think that this is not being handled, because I know for a fact that they're talking about this in many places and talking about what are we doing to be prepared. And it's not just the January 6th piece of it. We started seeing other civil disturbances for police and all the other things. So this has got our attention saying we have to be even more prepared and more tied into the local level.
Let me see if we can get one more in. Let's see, I see a hand right here. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks so much for this. I'm thinking kind of even more upstream and thinking about Election Day. I think we're all hearing a lot about poll workers that are very concerned with violence in those spaces. And I'm curious about anything you're aware of or ideas you have on, how we call for civic engagement in those spaces, how we get folks running for office to say violence is not acceptable, what that looks like, and trying to get even more ahead of this.
Okay, yeah.
Well, also one thing that Vet Voice is a member of is a group called Vet the Vote. This initiative stood up in 2022 to recruit veterans to serve as poll workers. We have a poll worker shortage in this country, unsurprisingly, because our elections have become so vitriolic and in some cases violent. We were able to recruit almost 100,000 poll workers through a partnership with the NFL and a lot of other groups. And that effort had two goals. One was to fill the poll worker shortage, and the other was to provide credible messengers who could push back on narratives about the election being stolen. To say, hey, look, man, like, you know me, I'm your neighbor. I served for 20 years in the Army, and I was there. Like, this was a legitimate election. And so I do think we need to be a little bit more strategic about who we're calling on, but also understand that these people are facing real threats. Chris Goldsmith, who you saw, was the leader of the Red Cell. He's an Army veteran, and he now studies extremists. He's been monitoring extremist movements for over a decade. And he has experienced the real-world impacts of that. The Charlottesville Nazis sued him personally, which they had no chance of winning, but required him to get legal defense and spend a lot of money. Thankfully, he had some pro bono representation there. Beyond that, his home has been swatted. That means extremists call the police and say that you are a danger to others, and they send armed police to your door. His family has been swatted multiple times. So people are not just facing existential threats or the threat of getting canceled or losing their job, but actual physical threats. And that's why I'm so grateful to General Singh and Senator Heitkamp and all the others who participated in this exercise, because it wasn't just an exercise in, okay, it's scary to appear on camera for an unscripted exercise about the most politicized issue in our country, one of the most, but that there's real world implications to physical safety, and that's something that I think we need to address, and folks are in a position from a funding perspective to support the efforts of local election workers. I know there's more interest and focus on that now, but it's a really big deal.
I want to just say thanks to, media gets beat up a lot, especially, if they think they're biased. But what I think has been a really important question that the media has asked over and over again is, will you accept the results of the election? And what we're hearing over and over again is if it was fair. Well, that's not the question. The question is, if you lose, you automatically assume it wasn't fair, and you aren't willing to accept that. And so I think that we need to have a conversation with every person who won't answer that question. The bedrock of American democracy is the peaceful transition of power. And that is what is at threat here. And we're finding out as Americans that there's no law or rule about this. There's a norm, and that norm has been breached, and we'll see what happens in November. But remember this, everybody predicted during the midterms that there would be all of the kind of Trump-supported Senate candidates in particular who would deny the legitimacy of the election. And even in close elections, they didn't do it with one exception. That's Kari Lake in Arizona. And so, let's hope that calmer heads prevail, that there will be enough pressure from the public and the media and really all of us as patriots and citizens to basically say, we trust our election, we trust the results, and we believe in our democracy, and you lost, and you need to go home.
I'm going to exercise moderator prerogative and pose the last question myself. And it gets to the how ready are we? We've had 4 years. We have the template for what this could look like. Have you shown this film to current officials in the White House, in Congress, at the Pentagon? What do they say?
So we are doing, we did a screening in DC 2 weeks ago. We're doing a screening on Capitol Hill. Senator Duckworth is hosting us for hopefully members on both sides of the aisle. And we've invited folks from the administration as well. The film is going to be in limited theatrical release starting in August in major cities. Then will be available on streaming services in October. And we're pairing that with a grassroots tour across mostly swing states and rural communities. We'll be at 30 to 50 colleges and universities in the early fall. I will say that just because folks are probably wondering, how do I see this thing? So major streaming services have unfortunately, this film is too political. They've told us that directly. They're afraid of their shareholders, and that is a reflection of the fractured and corporatized media environment that we live in now. So our intent as an organization and as a group is to get this out the good old-fashioned way by bringing it to folks all over the people, all over the country. But you know, I'll say, so I haven't gotten the feedback yet from the administration or Congress, but I will say, you know, when we delivered the report, it was kind of like, great, thank you, appreciate your input. I personally don't feel like we have taken this as seriously as we need to, not just at the federal level, but at the state level.
Yeah, so even though I'm not part of necessarily trying to make sure that we're pushing it out to all the right places. I shouldn't say that, but I'm supporting Janessa and team, but I am making sure that within my network, the people that I have access to, and I'm not going to go into names, but I'm talking some pretty senior level folks, have at least gotten to see this. And then trying to get them to encourage others to be able to either one, go to a viewing, or two, let's start really having some discussions around, are we seriously ready and what do we need to do? Because we still have time. And these are folks that are working in key positions down at the US Capitol, at state levels. And I think that, you know, from my perspective, that's what I can lend to this team, is continuing to push, and then also continuing to be able to push and be a voice where I'm willing to have that conversation. And no, by the way, don't come to my house, because I do have guns. And at least I have a police officer who also lives with me. So, so if you want to take that chance, go ahead, but please do not. And so I think we have to continue to kind of push that and be willing to have the conversation and also be a target.
I want to say, I think your question about Election Day is critical, because we're kind of anticipating that January 6th, you know, where all the ballots come in and that's the formalized process. They're going to be a lot better organized this time around beforehand. And they're going to work those state legislatures to try and delegitimize the vote count in every one of those states. By the time they were trying to have the false ballot work that they were doing, those things had already been done. And so they learned their lesson on how they need to start earlier. And so the one warning that I would have is, let's just not just focus on Washington. Let's take a look at how prepared the canvass boards in every state are, the electors in every state are to certify those elections and actually get those ballots in a box. You know, there was a point where the parliamentarian controls that box, and you may wonder why they trashed the parliamentarian's office. They were looking for those ballots. I mean, these were not stupid people who didn't understand this process. A lot of them were rogue protesters, but you saw the militant folks walking up the aisle. They knew exactly what they were after. And so, you know, if we don't become better prepared, then shame on us. Shame on us for not being better prepared.
Janessa Goldbeck, General Linda Singh, Senator Heidi Heitkamp. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.